coffee cup in class. I needed a more
robust,
attention-getting memorable props. That when we're contemplating the existence of the coffee cup, we have something more.
You're fine.
We have something more substantial, something that imprints itself on the memory.
That's right. There's going to be 1,000 people walking around with yellow Yeti cups.
That's right.
Inspired by the rabbi.
This is the new. Yes. Yeah, you can get branding on these. It's an idea. It's an idea for the class.
I don't know if you've seen the
Okay, it is. We are in the middle of chapter 4 of Tanya. We began reading, and we began explaining as well last time. Chapter 4 of Tanya is about the garments of the soul, the levushim, thought, speech, and action. I'm going to apologize to anyone watching online in advance because it looks like the connection is not particularly good today, maybe connected to some of the storms we're having and things like that. The garments of the soul are, what does the soul as a finite being do? How does it interface? How does it relate to other selves, other things outside of itself? And we read last time the answer, that the thought, speech, and action of the godly soul are expressed in the performance of mitzvahs and the learning of Torah. The fact is that most of the rest of this chapter is about mitzvahs. Chapter 5, which is the next chapter, is about Torah. So these two are our theme from now on, which is what's the deal with Torah and mitzvahs. And of course, we have remarked before, and we'll keep remarking because it's really a major theme of our chapter, that it's interesting that in a whole book about serving God and connecting to God, we only get to the whole concept of a mitzvah or the Torah in chapter 4, right? Even talking about the godly soul, you want to say, okay, maybe the animal soul isn't so into doing commandments of God. Even talking about the godly soul, it's the 3rd chapter on the godly soul that we first begin to get into the commandments and the study of Torah. And there's a reason for that. The reason for that is that the order of the Alter Rebbe here in Tanya is he's going from the most essential, the most inward, the deepest and the truest and the innermost aspect of the soul, and he is working outward in order. So the deepest, truest, innermost aspect of the godly soul is that it's literally a piece of God above. But then when you say that's not really something, that can't be all that the soul is, because we know the soul is a finite being that interacts with other finite beings, it has rational relations in the world, etc. It's a finite being that relates to other finite beings. Then we explain in chapter 3 that yes, the finite being of the godly soul, the limited being of the godly soul, the way that piece of God manifests itself and builds itself at the level of finitude in the external world is in the form of seichel and midos, intellect and emotions. And of course, because it's the godly soul, all of its intellect and emotions are directed towards God. There's nothing else that it can, that it does or wants to, or maybe even can interact with. It's totally directed towards God and godliness in every way. In chapter 4 of Tanya, we begin to discuss, but what does this finite being do? Because if it was just intellect and emotions, it could sit totally passive, totally inert, right? And it could just be. It could just be intellect and emotions. But we know that the godly soul is not built that way. We know that the godly soul is given the capacity, both souls are given the capacity not just to sit inert, but to act and to go out of itself, to express itself within the external world. And those capacities are called machshava, dibur, and maisa, thought, speech, and action, which together are the levushim, are the garments or the interfaces of the soul. And because the godly soul's thought, speech, and action are totally directed towards God, therefore its thought, speech, and action are all in Torah and Mitzvahs. It has no quote-unquote secular thought, speech, and action, although as we'll see shortly in a few chapters later in Tanya, the whole concept of the secular, it's questionable whether it even really exists, especially to the Alter Rebbe. But the godly soul certainly has no interest in it one way or the other, if it exists or doesn't exist. The godly soul is not interested. The godly soul is interested only in God, which is its deepest nature, of course, because its deepest nature is that it is literally a piece of God. And the question is, if the godly soul in its deepest nature is literally a piece of God, and it can't get any closer to God, because its closeness to God is absolute. In fact, it's so close that we say it's one with God. It's unified with God. It's a piece of God. That's what that language means, at least half of that language. The other half holds the answer to the question I'm about to ask, which is, why would a godly soul need to do anything at all? Right? It's not, as we keep saying and will continue to say emphatically, it's not because of some idea of self-perfection. Right? Maybe you could say it's for the perfection of the animal soul. That's a whole other thing, which we'll get to later, right? And that's very true to a large extent. That why it would be able to do anything is to be able to interact with the animal soul. Okay, fair enough. What about in its own terms, though? Right? Because in this chapter, we're not talking about the animal soul. We're talking about why does the godly soul do mitzvahs per se. The godly soul has an ability to act. Not even if there is no animal soul there, it has an ability to have thoughts and speech and action. It can express itself. It can go outside of itself. Why would it ever want to go outside of itself? In a sense, isn't it going outside of itself, going outside its connection to God? Because that's what itself is, right? That is what this chapter is, the theme of this chapter is how do we understand mitzvahs? How do we understand the commandments of the Torah in light of the fact that we have already automatically gotten rid of, without even speaking to it in the text of Tanya, we've already gotten rid of the concept that the Jew's connection to God is purely through his behavior. That concept never even has a chance to arise in Tanya before it is destroyed, right? It's obviously not true. The Jew's connection to God is inherent, right, by dint of what he is, not what he does, right? So the question remains, number one, why is there even a what he does? Why does he even have an ability to do a what he does if he's already connected to God and what he is? And number two, which is more of a broader question, not within the Tanya, it's more of a meta question about the understanding of Chassidus in general, which is, if we're all about the inner truth of things and the inner connection to God, why does all of Judaism seem to be about the mitzvahs? Right? Judaism puts a tremendous emphasis on the action, right? Fulfilling the commandment, even technically fulfilling the commandment, is better than passionately not fulfilling it in Judaism, right? So the question is, is it not the opposite of everything that Chassidus seems to believe from the first 3 chapters of Tanya, that the mitzvahs should be so important, that we should be so technical, that our connection, God forbid, to God is through a certain set of technicalities, right? Did you happen to put on tefillin today, right? It's like kind of a bizarre question is that. I literally am a piece of God above. Did I put on tefillin? Did I put leather straps on today because it's for my good behavior, right? The whole concept is ridiculous. Why would my behavior have any say at all, right? It would seem, one might ask, right? In this inner view, in this mystical view of Judaism, that is the question that we are working towards the answer of, not so long away here in the chapter. It's explained at length, but the core of the answer is coming up quite soon. We explained last time part of the answer is, the first thing you have to realize, and we spent most of last class talking about this, for the first thing you have to realize is that action is not technical. It's the first thing you have to realize. So we explained that the thought, the speech, and the action are all expressions of the soul, right? Which means that even the action, which is very important because it's a large part of what mitzvahs are, is action, right? Shaking the lulav, putting the coin in the tzedakah box, lighting the Shabbos candle, wrapping the tefillin. The action of the mitzvah, the physical action, is not like we in our society intuitively understand, right? Where it is the manipulation of external and technical circumstances. In Chassidus' view, the action is an expression of the soul no less than speech, right? Speech expresses what's on my mind, so does action. The only difference is what letters am I using? That's really the difference. What are my words made of? But when a Jew wraps tefillin, he's expressing his soul with words that are made of leather, right? But it's not that he's technically arranging physical matter so that it achieves a certain technical state, right? That's not it at all. In fact, we said in last class, which I think really which I stumbled upon by accident, but I think really actually clarified it for me as well, which often happens in these classes, by the way, behind the scenes. Really, when the Jew puts on tefillin, they're no longer tefillin anymore, really. Just as when a person wears a shirt, it's no longer a shirt, right? Now, you have to understand what that means. We don't mean there's any physical change, and on the contrary, the shirt is most a shirt when the person wears it, in one understanding, right? But in a different sense, the shirt is no longer a shirt, because a shirt is an object that's not a person, right? When the person is wearing a shirt, this is a whole other story, right? The object has become what we call in Chassidus batel, one of the most important words in all of Chassidus. The shirt has become nullified. It has lost its state as an independent object and is now the word that is being used to express the soul. And what specifically of the soul? That's what we're going to get into, God willing, in the chapter. It's used to express the soul. No less than when a person takes ink and he puts it in a pen, and he uses that pen to write a letter, the ink is no longer ink like it was in the ink jar, in the ink well. It is and it isn't, right? It's still the same physical substance, but this ink is now the medium, is now the means by which this person is able to express the utterly ephemeral, the utterly transcendent, the fire of his soul, his deepest intellect and his deepest passions, his deepest emotions. It has ceased to be a mere object in the external world and has become a means of his self-expression. And then now to connect it back to an even earlier class, which was a while ago in this chapter, in one of our introductory classes, really everything is like this. There's nothing that's not a medium to a self, right? There is no such thing as a truly independent thing, like we perceive a bottle of ink to be before a person gets involved with it. The truth is that a bottle of ink is made with a certain intentions. It's already human interaction, right? It's already an artifact, but you could say even a pebble or a leaf or a dust whirling on a storm in Jupiter, right? You can use whatever example you like. There is no such thing as an object in this sense. There is no such thing as a object that is purely of the external world. What we call the external world is itself an expression of the internal divine world, right? So really all there is an interaction of selves. There is no actual, a thing in Chassidus is just a metaphor, or it's just ink that broke free, right? Or that appears to have broken free. Yeah, there's no such thing as a thing. There's only metaphors whose meaning we don't currently perceive, right? You could say something like that. In other words, there's no object in the external world. There's only the interaction of selves, whether the divine self or the self of a soul, right? But this concept that there's just things that are not there conveying any self-expression, that are just dead things, right? So there is no such concept in Chassidus. There are no dead things, right? There's only things that maybe temporarily appear to be dead for whatever reason. All of that we've explained in previous classes, and all of this is very important because, why is it important? It's important because the message of chapter 3 of Tanya, you take nothing else away. You have to take away that the mitzvahs and the divine commandments are expressions of the soul. We're going to talk about this more today inside the text, God willing, but the idea is, and really, it's stated, it's one of these things in Tanya that it's stated so plainly and so directly that you need to read it 100 times just to see it, right? The mitzvahs are an expression of the soul, right? See, I just said it and it doesn't sound like anything. It sounds like I said nothing. The mitzvahs are an expression of the soul, as opposed to, when you add the as opposed to, it becomes clearer, right? As opposed to an external imposition of God on you. That's what it's opposed to, right? The mitzvah, and this answer, by understanding this answers all our questions about the mitzvahs that we were talking about a moment ago, right? The mitzvahs, the divine commandments, are not an external imposition. The divine commandments are the natural expression of the godly soul. The godly soul wants nothing other than mitzvahs. Why specifically these actions and these commandments? We'll get to that shortly in Tanya. That's what this whole chapter is sort of grappling with, right? Because we have to start building this other understanding of Judaism, which we've been doing piece by piece. It's hard to put it together. There's lots of parts and lots of intricacies and things like that. But if you step back, right, there's a fundamental question. The fundamental question is, as I heard someone phrase it once, is, are there 613 things in my way? Or are there 613 means that I express myself? Right? Those are really fundamentally the two options. Right? Now, it's true that in Chassidus we may agree that at some level, I mentioned this last time as well, at some level it may be that there are 613 things that are in your way, because the animal soul is not as naturally, doesn't understand what the commandments are in the same way as the godly soul does. So in other words, if a person does feel like that, we're not invalidating it. On the contrary, that's quite natural, that the animal soul, which has no inherent sense of the divine really, has no appreciation for the divine commandments. That's to be expected. However, setting that aside for a moment and talking about the godly soul, right, which is as real as the animal soul, if not more real, if we dare to say, the godly soul does not see the 613 commandments of the Torah as an external imposition. Not an imposition. That's actually underselling it. It doesn't see it as an external guide even, right? In other words, the commandments of the Torah are not to the godly soul something that it's never heard before. It's not like the godly soul shows up to Mount Sinai and God says, okay, got to put on the leather boxes on your arm, and the godly soul says, that's bizarre, but okay. That's what the animal soul says, right? If it's feeling like it's okay at the moment. Ideally, it will say it's okay. The animal soul will. The godly soul, right? The godly soul sees this as the natural means of its expression, right? In other words, if you have someone that was born if you have someone that was a born poet or painter or speech writer or dancer, any really self-expressive mode, right? And you have someone that's born not just with the talent, but often what comes with the talent is almost a need to express themselves in that particular fashion, right? They feel if they don't express themselves in this way, that they're not coming across at all, right? This isn't until they find that thing, they don't feel like they've been able to ever really express themselves, for lack of a better term, right? When they finally do encounter that natural means of expressing themselves, they don't say, wow, the details of this are bizarre, right? If you're a writer, I can speak of that with a little bit of experience, dancing not as much. If you're a writer and you get your hands on a pen and ink for the first time and find that you're good at writing, you don't sit and ask questions about the consistency of the ink. And why does the ink have to flow this way across the paper? That's not a writer. That's an engineer. That's a whole other issue, right? So we don't have any engineers here today, so we won't, well, a little bit, kind of, but we won't get into that. Okay, fine, a full engineer. I don't want to insult anyone. I thought being called the engineer was the insult. I'm trying to back away. Nothing is an insult, God forbid. Everything has its place, even the engineers. That's why the Rebbe was an engineer, to show that it was possible to be a good person and an engineer. So it's a joke, by the way. The person who comes to this means of expression, who finds their medium, doesn't start asking questions about but this seems so strange. Why does the pen have to be written on paper and not on trees like it should be written on trees? Some people are like that, but that's because that's not their means, right? I'm talking about when they find their thing, right? When they find their thing, that's not what they ask. When they find their thing, it's natural. And when they find their thing, the reason they don't ask questions is because they don't even see the ink and the paper and the pen as separate objects at all. These aren't things out in the world, right? These were waiting for me to help me express myself, right? which is maybe at some level an egotistic thing, but I think generally speaking, not so terrible. Not so terrible. On the contrary, I think Judaism would say on the contrary, maybe that's why God created those things, right? That you should be able to express yourself in a positive way, right? These things were waiting for me. These things are not, it's not like I've never heard of this. This is so weird. This is so bizarre. That's what you would say if this isn't your thing, right? So Torah and mitzvahs are the godly soul's thing. Torah and mitzvahs, for reasons we are going to explain, we're not going to just leave it at that and say, it is that way, deal with it. We're going to explain why, right? And it's a very, very profound reason why, as we're going to see. But the Torah and mitzvahs are the godly soul's thing. When the godly soul wants to express itself, when it wants to interface and interact, and we still haven't answered the question, but we're going to, why would it interface and interact at all? Why would it act at all? But why would it express itself at all? But when it does want to express itself, the completely natural way of doing so is Torah and mitzvahs. So in other words, you have to start building this view, because in Chassidus this is taken to whole other realms and all other places. But this is the foundation. The mitzvahs come from within, they don't come from without. Right? The mitzvahs as an imposition by an external being is for the animal soul, right? To a large extent. The godly soul is one with God. The godly soul, the mitzvahs are deep in the godly soul, as deep as they are in God, which is another way of saying there's no deeper, right? As deep as it goes, the commandments are in the godly soul. That's the takeaway. If there's any one takeaway, if you have to go away with only one thing from this chapter, that should be the takeaway. So when we wrap tefillin, we're not meant to be, at least in terms of the godly soul, we're not meant to be doing something that was externally imposed. We're meant to be doing something that's an act of self-expression, and this has not been given to me to get in the way of what I am. This is given to me as the only means and the perfect means of externalizing and showing everyone and manifesting and bringing forth exactly what it is that I am. Yeah, these are old friends. These are not strangers. These are from within, not from without. These are chosen, not impositions. Right? That's the when a chassid looks at a mitzvah, that's how you're supposed to look at a mitzvah. Right? With the animal soul, it's difficult. With the animal soul, we have to work. It doesn't feel that way all the time. However, to know that this is nevertheless the truth is already half the battle. Right? To know that there is a godly soul and that the godly soul does feel this way is already a huge leg up, because the person can convince themselves that they have no connection to wrapping tefillin, right? And the truth is that that's not true. The putting on tefillin is closer to you than you are to yourself, is the truth. That is if there's a one-line takeaway, right? That should be the takeaway. We are on page 14 in the English, page Ches in the Hebrew, first page of chapter 4, Perek Daled. We read last time the first line, more or less, the first few lines. Let's start from, in other words, let's just read from the top here. Perek Daled, chapter 4. Furthermore, every godly soul has three garments. The garments are thought, speech, and action. What are the thought, speech, and action? The thought, speech, and action are of the 613 commandments of the Torah. When a person fulfills in action all of the action commandments of the Torah, and in speech he toils in explaining the 613 commandments, which all of Torah study in a way can be seen as an explanation of the 613 commandments. It's a way of looking at Torah. The Hilchei and their laws. And then in his thought, he grasps everything that he has the ability to grasp. Bepardes HaTorah, in the pardes of the Torah. I'll mention again what that means in a moment. The 613 organs or limbs of the soul are enclosed in the 613 commandments of the Torah. Let's pause here. Just a note on the pardes of the Torah, which we mentioned last time. Right? The pardes of the Torah, pardes means orchard, right? The Pardes, the four letters of Pardes are an acronym for Pshat, Remez, Drush, and Seid, which are the four categories or types of Torah study in Judaism. The Pshat is the simple meaning. The Remez is the implicit meaning, or the hinted to, the allusions of the Torah. Drush is the full systematic learning of Torah, which is what you'll find mostly in the Talmud and the Midrash, right? Where it's not just looking at allusions in one place or another, it's using a systematic system of rules and study to derive new meanings and derive new implications from the Torah. And then, of course, you have Seid, which means secret, which is the esoteric meaning of the Torah, the inner meaning, the soul of Torah. Torah not as it, we might say, not as it relates externally, but as it is, right? As it relates to itself. Those are the four levels of Torah study. And these, the action of the mitzvahs, the speaking of the words of Torah, because if you know, the commandment to learn Torah can only be fulfilled when you speak the words, right? You don't mentally learn Torah. Torah is meant to be spoken out loud in a way that you can hear it, and the motion of the lips is the speaking of the speaking of the understanding of Torah. And then you have your mind, of course, which is very involved in Torah study and understanding and comprehending the Torah. These are the garments of the godly soul. The godly soul does mitzvahs, and it speaks and it thinks about Torah. That's how the Alter Rebbe breaks it down right here. And these are the thought, speech, and action of the godly soul. Briefly, again, we spoke about this last time at length. Thought, speech, and action. The difference is thought is expression to oneself using the letters that come from the soul. Speech is expression to others using letters that come from the soul. Action is external expression whose letters come from outside as well. Where the medium, as we were just discussing about physical mitzvahs, where the medium comes from outside of the person. The person uses letters that are not from within their own soul, but are found externally as means of the soul's expression. That's thought, speech, and action. These are the thought, speech, and action of the godly soul. And for more detail on everything we've spoken about up until this point, see our previous classes on this chapter, where we've gone over everything we've said pretty much until now in great depth. Yeah, everyone with me more or less?
Yes. Quick question.
Sure.
Is it true that the esoteric, that there was the first Torah that was given to Moses that was broken was actually the white letters, the white fire letters, and that's actually the inner dimension, the esoteric meaning of the Torah, and that they didn't get it and now we're getting it now, we're deriving it?
There is such a concept I believe I've heard about. I've also heard that the esoteric level of the Torah is the light from the first day that was hidden away and will only be revealed in the times of Mashiach, but now we're getting a glimmer of the light from the first day. So there's many such concepts, of course, but the truth is that at the external level, the inner truth of the Torah was always taught in truth. It's just a question of how much it was revealed, right? The difference now is that people like us can learn it. That's really the difference now. Although the inner secrets of Torah were always preserved by the scholars who could handle it. Let's put it that way. Why you wouldn't be able to handle the esoteric secrets of the Torah is itself not a secret, but it's something we can discuss a different time. It has to do with the capacity for misinterpretation, which unfortunately has happened many, many times in history. Generally speaking, people who are unserious and Kabbalah do not mix well. The two things go together and produce disasters from the merely amusing to the truly world-shattering, like Shabad Tzvi, right? Which was truly disastrous, right? Disastrous. Shabad Tzvi was a false messiah in the 1600s, who many Jews all over the world were convinced was going to come and usher in the Messianic age and take all the Jews to Israel. And he, in the end, the Sultan got angry at him and said, "You convert to Islam, or we kill you," and he converted to Islam. And that was the end of Shabad Tzvi, bringing great spiritual desolation in ways that it would take a very long time to explain. But the fact is that this was a breaking of the heart of world Jewry to a large extent, and the fallout of the lack of trust that came about because of this whole incident ended up having it. In a way, it actually still has ramifications to this day. In a way, the damage that was done by all of this created a rupture in the trust, not just the people of the rabbis, but the rabbis of other rabbis, and no one knows who anyone is, because the whole thing is that it was like a secret society, so no one knows who's secretly a follower of Shabtai Tzvi and who's not, and the accusations were flying among the giants of Torah, and all of this was going on, and made it extremely difficult to have a simple and pure relationship to Judaism, which is one of the things that the Jewish people were suffering from, that the Baal Shem Tov came to help them with. One of their spiritual sufferings. There was a spiritual suffering after Shabtai Tzvi. There was a physical suffering after Tach V'Tat, which was the Khmelnytsky massacres in Poland, where some estimates say that 1 million Jews died. Contemporary estimates try and push it lower. I'm not getting involved. I don't know whose estimates are based on what. Many, many Jews died, generally seen as the worst calamity for the Jews in Europe before the Holocaust. So that happened. Shabtai Tzvi happened, then that happened. So you had physical and spiritual desolation. The Baal Shem Tov came and revealed the hidden light of Chassidus to try and rectify and fix all of this, long story short. So there was always secrets of the Torah, but the secrets of the Torah were kept secret. The reason they're called secrets is not because they were kept secret, by the way, as I mentioned last week. They're called, what makes the secrets of the Torah a secret is not that you don't tell them to people. It's that you tell them to people and they still have no idea what you're talking about. That's what makes them a secret, right? They remain, they're inherently concealed. And the truth is that at a deeper level, the whole term of esotericism and secret is not meant to imply, it has nothing to do with who knows about it or who may know the words. It has to do with a certain sense of intimacy and profundity, right? Which is exactly what its place at the top of the 4 levels of Torah understanding is meant to imply, right? In other words, there's the Torah that's like I said before, that's external, right? In every sense. It's external because it's among the people. It's external because it speaks to the lowest possible things in the world, like the laws of the Torah tells you how to tie your shoelaces, right? Then you have the level of the Torah, which is internal, which addresses not the world as it redounds to the lowest possible place, but the world as it reaches to the highest possible heights, right? It's a whole other orientation in Torah. Right? And most of the Kabbalah, of course, speaks about higher worlds and angels and spiritual realities, right? And not to the lowly physical reality. And that's part of what the word secret implies. In other words, not a secret like hush hush necessarily, right? It's the secrets of God, meaning the business of God is what is beyond and above and transcends the world as it is and its mundanity, right? Etc. Anyway, so and specifically, in particular, Bechinas Chabad Shebenafshe, the Chachma, Bina, and Das, the intellect of the soul, Muluvashas Bahasagas Atar, are enclosed in the comprehension of Torah. Shumasik Bepardes Kefi Yechelis Asagase, that he contemplates, he comprehends the Pardes, the 4 levels of Torah, according to the ability of his understanding, V'sheresh Nafshe L'mayla, and according to the source of his soul above. In other words, first we said that, so let's take it step by step. The first thing we said is that the soul expression of the godly soul, the way the godly soul expresses itself, is in Torah and Mitzvahs. That's the general statement, right? There's thought, speech, and action, and what we mean by thought, speech, and action is Torah and Mitzvahs. That's in general, right? Now we're saying, and particularly, right? I forgot to mention, pardon me, there's one other thing I wanted to explain, which we mentioned last week, the 613 limbs of the soul. Right? The 613 limbs or organs of the soul refer to the 10 faculties we were talking about in the previous chapter. Now there's 613 and not 10. That's how it goes. And again, I forgot again to look up and again to look up once more. I once knew it. How you get from 10 to 613. There's a whole Kabbalistic explanation of how the 10 faculties break down into 613. Mathematical, spiritual explanation, which I have forgotten, unfortunately, and forgotten to look up again. So there is a way in which the 613 equals 10. In their particulars, the 10 faculties of the soul are the 613 mitzvahs, the 613 commandments, and the 10 limbs of the 10 faculties of the soul are the 613 limbs of the soul. And the two things are not a coincidence that they're both 613. You may have thought they were. No one thought that. They're both 613 because every aspect of the soul has its mitzvah that it expresses itself through. And if a person is fully performing all 613 commandments of the Torah, the person's soul is fully expressed, is fully manifest. You could be wondering interesting questions, like there is no one Jew that is obligated in all 613 commandments of the Torah, for example, right? Some of the mitzvahs are for a king, some of the mitzvahs are for a kohen, and a kohen can't be a king because a king is from Judah and a kohen is from Levi, right? For example, some of the mitzvahs are for men, some of the mitzvahs are for women. Can't be a man and a woman in the Torah, right? Some of the mitzvahs are for in the land, some of the mitzvahs are for out of the land, right? In other words, we have issues. We have issues with technically understanding what this means, right? These questions have answers. The answers, generally speaking, involve the notion, which is a very interesting concept spoken about elsewhere in Chassidus, that all Jews are guarantors for one another, which means that the way that your soul fulfills a mitzvah, if you personally don't have the ability to fulfill it, is through other Jewish souls. There is such a thing as a collective fulfillment of mitzvahs, which again has to be treated delicately because it's for mitzvahs that you can't do yourself, not mitzvahs that you can do yourself. You can do it yourself, the collective, although the truth is that even in some mitzvahs that you can do for yourself, it's not so simple, right? We have the concept of being yotze, right? Of someone else fulfilling your mitzvah. Like we all listen to the rabbi making Kiddush on Shabbos and say Amen, and then it's as if we all did it, right? That's also connected to this concept, right? Where we don't physically have to actually do it ourselves, right? Our obligation can be fulfilled by one person doing it for us, right? Etc. Another example was when we were students in yeshiva. Students in yeshiva generally don't light Shabbos candles. There usually are actually one or two people that do for whatever reason. But generally speaking, when you're a student at yeshiva, you don't light Shabbos candles. Why? Because your mother lights Shabbos candles for the family, right? Her lighting Shabbos candles with you in mind, wherever she is fulfilling your obligation to light Shabbos candles. Is, I believe, the psak. This is not a halacha class. Don't rely on this. This is not. Don't try this at home. This is the Tanya. The Tanya teacher's understanding of halacha, and he doesn't even understand Tanya. Never mind halacha. So it's to be used at your own risk. But that's how I understand it anyway.
So I was at Noah's house, and he was doing Kiddush, and he said like he had his sons do it, and he had me do it.
Yes, there's a custom that each person should do it for themselves because there's a concept that beautifies the mitzvah. Although, by the way, there is an argument in the other direction simultaneously, which is called Berev Am Hadras Melech, which means that the glory of the king is in public. If there's a mitzvah, the fact that many people do it together is more glorious. That's the argument in the other direction. But there's also an argument that if it's so precious, you want to do it yourself. Right? So now, welcome to Judaism. There's an argument in both directions. You go figure out, someone will help you figure out what the thing to actually do is. Anyway, there's varying customs, long story short. That's in general. In general, the soul's 10 faculties, which are 613, right, in their particulars, right? That soul is expressed through the 613 commandments of the Torah. If there's some commandments that you don't fulfill, and you can't fulfill, other Jews fulfill. Other Jews in space, other Jews in time. Yes? But then the Alter Rebbe says, but in particular, right, it's not that all of the soul is expressed through as we sort of implied already, it's not that all of the soul is expressed through everything. There's that, in general, that's true. All of the soul is expressed through Torah and mitzvahs, right? But now we break down and say, really, the intellect of the soul is expressed through thinking, right? It's through the understanding of the Torah according to the ability of the person's comprehension and the source of their soul, which it should be noted in the Alter Rebbe's language is two separate things, right? There's number one, there's your understanding, right? Not everyone is created with the same intellectual capacity. Some people have more, some people have less. But then beyond intellectual capacity, even two people with the same intellectual capacity may have souls that come from different sources, which means that they may have a greater capacity for grasping the truth of the Torah or of particular parts of the Torah than others do.
Can you go into that a little bit more? What do you mean from different places?
Different souls come from different worlds, as we discussed in the second chapter of Tanya. And the different worlds that the soul comes from are associated with different aspects of Torah and Mitzvahs. There's a famous story. I want to say it was with the Arizal. I forget the name. There was a Kabbalist, I think it was the Arizal, who used to give a lecture in, I'm going to butcher the whole story, but so I'm not going to tell it as a story even, I'm just going to describe the story. There was a Kabbalist who gave a class in a certain type of Torah, right? Like let's say he used to teach Kabbalah, right? Or he used to teach, not Kabbalah, he used to teach Talmud, whatever, a different one of the parts or aspects of Torah, right? And he used to have a student who was a very eager student and very close to this teacher who would attend all of his other classes. When he would come to this class, he would sit down and he would immediately fall asleep. He couldn't stay awake to study this in this class, even though this was his teacher and he was a genius and he could understand it intellectually, but for some reason he would just fall asleep. And the Arizal explained to him that his soul came from a different place. In other words, this part of Torah was not the part of Torah that his soul in particular resonated with. Other parts of Torah resonated with him more, right? Of course, in general, the entire Torah is for every Jew, and Jews are actually, if you read the Alter Rebbe's Laws of Torah Study, which is both recommended and not recommended for different reasons. It's recommended because it tells you what you have to do in terms of Torah study, and it's not recommended for the same reason, right? Because ignorance is bliss. If you read the Alter Rebbe's Laws of Torah Study, you find out just the extent to which we are obligated, which is profound. But if you read there, you'll see that there's a whole plan set out there for how a Jew can learn the entire Torah, right? And fundamentally, that is every Jew, if it's in their capacity, right, is a Jew should know the entire Torah. Kol Torah Kula, as it's called, right? You should know the entire Torah, which doesn't technically mean reading the impossible for any one person to read number of books. There's a certain curriculum which is called the entire Torah, even though technically it's impossible to learn the entire Torah for a human being to learn the entire Torah. But there's a certain curriculum, right, which people are obligated to follow, etc. I'm getting distracted very easily. Okay. It should be noted that if the Torah was purely intellectual, the root of your soul would make no difference. Right? If the Torah was purely intellectual, why would the root of your soul make a difference? You wouldn't say the root of the soul. It would say the person doesn't have a particular talent for learning this type of thing, right? Not everyone's a mathematician. Not everyone's an engineer. Thank God. There's all different capacities, all different talents, right? But here it talks about the root of the soul. The root of the soul is because the Torah is divine wisdom, right? It's a different thing than regular worldly wisdom, which is why the persons, as the Rebbe always says in a number of talks, that it doesn't make a difference to a dentist if they like or find teeth particularly interesting, or if they practice what they preach in terms of their dental health. It doesn't affect their understanding of dentistry one iota necessarily, right? It's like the old joke about how you could always go to the hospital and see the orderly smoking outside, right? Even though every doctor in the hospital would yell at you for smoking, right? It doesn't make a difference. They could still be very good doctors even if they do that, right? There's no real connection, right? It may be a very slight connection, you could argue, but really very tenuous, right? The Torah is different. Torah knowledge, as the Rebbe said many times, because it is holy wisdom and not wisdom that is naturally within the capability of a human being to understand. It is not finite wisdom. It is infinite wisdom. It is not worldly seichel, worldly intellect. It is godly intellect Therefore, the state of the person, their state of holiness and their state of personal refinement, makes a real difference in terms of their ability to comprehend the Torah. This is an argument the Rebbe would say repeatedly. A person who violates the Torah, their understanding of the Torah goes with it. You can only really understand the Torah by keeping it. It's not like other forms of wisdom. And this is connected to that. The truth is as we're going to see in the as I keep mentioning, we're going to see soon in Tanya, this goes back to the difference between Chachma Pnimis and Chachma Chitzonis, the inner wisdom of Torah, and the superficial understanding of Torah, where the inner wisdom of Torah is, pardon me. It goes back to inner wisdom and superficial wisdom. The Torah is called inner wisdom, right? Wisdoms of the world are called superficial wisdom. The reason for this is connected to this idea that we're discussing, because the inner wisdom is the knowledge that God has of things from the inside as their creator, more or less, whereas the superficial wisdom is the wisdom that you gain of things from the outside as something other than the thing that you're studying, right? So in other words, their nature is inherently different. Torah wisdom is inherently different because it's the only thing, being a divine revelation, that can come from the opposite direction, that can come not a knowledge of the thing as it is, but a knowledge of the thing as it comes forth from its source, right? As it says, as the Talmud says, Ezer Chacham, who is wise, Hareya es hanelad, he sees what's being born, right? And the simple meaning of the Talmud is that a wise person sees what's coming down the road, right? They're not just looking at the present, they're looking at what the present is going to mean for the future. That's what wise is, right? The Hasidic interpretation of Hareya es hanelad is Hareya es hanelad me'ayin leyesh. The person who is wise can see what is born from nothing into something, right? He sees how everything has its root in nothingness and derives from God, right? Which is the inner wisdom. That's what we would say in Chassidus. Okay, that's the note on Torah study. And again, it's interesting to note here that what we spoke about before, about the mitzvahs, we didn't have a chance to really get to this last week, although it's in my notes. What we discussed about mitzvahs, that putting on the tefillin is a soul expression, right? And really that's the harder one to understand. So this is just a very easy application of that idea to Torah as well. But this understanding will help us appreciate that the way we think of Torah is also incorrect, right? Because here we're saying that Torah study is a manifestation of the soul. You see the issue? There's this we normally think of Torah study in a very different way, right? I'm a person. I don't know, right? Along comes this wisdom from the top of Mount Sinai, and now I have to sit down and study the wisdom, right? So there's me, and then there's the wisdom that I'm acquiring from the outside, right? There's wisdom, Torah wisdom I'm acquiring. It comes to me externally, right? Here, we're saying Torah wisdom is an expression of the soul, right? It is how does the soul's 613 limbs manifest themselves externally? They manifest as the Torah, right? Specifically, their intellect manifests as the understanding of the Torah. As we're going to see, the emotions manifest as the mitzvahs. We're going to see in a moment. But the intellect manifests as understanding of the Torah, right? But I don't understand. It's all backwards. If it's a manifestation of the soul, it should be knowledge that comes from the inside. It shouldn't be knowledge that I have to acquire, right? And the truth is, the real truth is, the real answer to this question is, as we will see, real Torah study is a whole different story. Because real Torah study, when we're talking about grasping the divine wisdom, right, is only by dint of the godly soul. Only the godly soul can really unify with the true wisdom of Torah. And when it does, it is the Torah coming from the inside, not from the outside. This, as we mentioned last time, there's the concept of the baby knows the entire Torah in the womb, and then the angel hits it on the lip and it forgets, right? This is part of that concept. The concept is that we know already the entire Torah, right? The act of externally having to go acquire it is an act of remembering, not an act of actual acquiring, not an act of actual acquisition. The Torah is already in the soul's possession, and as we will see, as we discussed already when we were discussing Chachma and how the wisdom, the highest intellectual faculty of the soul comes from a place that the soul doesn't perceive, right? The soul sees a truth of God, and the truth that it sees is not an external one, but an internal one. It sees the truth of God within itself, right? Because at the level of Chachma, the external world doesn't even exist, right? Chachma is the act of constructing the external self. The external self doesn't even really exist in Chachma, right? Chachma is the soul's perception of the truth of the divine by dint of itself. It's perceiving its own unity with the divine, and the truth is that as the Torah goes up towards or it depends how you look at it, down to the depths of Torah, or up to the heights of Torah, however you want to describe it, right? The Torah converges on that same reality. It converges on the same place where the soul knows God by knowing itself. The truth is that the Torah is a manifestation of the soul, not vice versa. It's not something the soul has to acquire from the outside. The truth is this is easier to understand with ideas than it is with physical objects. So since we understand it about mitzvahs, with the Torah it should be fairly more straightforward to understand that the Torah is an expression of the soul. The Torah knowledge is an expression of what the soul is. It's made for the soul's natural means of expression. The difference is that in intellect, the letters don't come from outside, the letters come from inside, right? Whereas the physical box of leather comes from the outside, the actual Torah comes in a much more profound sense from the inside. Okay. Let's see if I can read these notes, and I'll see if I can explain them to you. Okay, let's continue. I want to get to the main point, the punchline. We have about, I'd say 5-10 more minutes, yeah. Va'amidos, the second sentence of the chapter, right? By Chassidus standards, this was a very short sentence, by the way. It's only almost a quarter of a page, third of a page. Va'amidos, shehein yira va'ava v'anfein v'toldesein. And the emotional qualities, which are fear and love, that's the order they were in the previous chapter, you may recall. The anfehen and their branches, because as we explained in the previous chapter, all the other emotional qualities are just expressions or manifestations of love and fear. But all they say, and their branches and their descendants, their children. Melubasha is b'kiyum mitzvahs. They are enclosed in the fulfillment of the commandments. B'maiseh ubedibur, in thought, in action, and in speech, Talmud Torah keneged kulam, which there's action, mitzvahs in action, and speech, which is the act of studying Torah, which is, as we say in the davening, is keneged kulam, has the worth of all the mitzvahs put together. By the way, Torah is not the only mitzvah that we say about it, that it's like all the other mitzvahs put together. There's several. Tefillin is another example. Tzedakah is another example. In the Talmud, when it talks about mitzvah, it means tzedakah. When it says mitzvah, it means giving charities. There's different mitzvahs which are representative mitzvahs of all of them, if I recall correctly. But here we're talking about Talmud Torah Keneged. Torah is a famous example. That the study of Torah is like all of the mitzvahs. It's like all of the commandments in its worth, right? Commandments of the Torah, which we perceive, and it's not our fault because this is how Judaism is, which we perceive as technicalities, right, are manifestations of the love and fear of the soul. A mitzvah is love. Whose love? Your love. It's even more surprising, right? So they say the mitzvahs are love. Okay, maybe God loves me, he gives me mitzvah. No. Not his love. Your love. The mitzvah is your love for God, right? That's what your mitzvah is. And this, as we will see, is actually the explanation of why we have mitzvahs at all. Even though love is before the fourth chapter, even though love we talked about the previous chapter, as we're going to see, the love in the previous chapter has a deficiency that only manifestation in action and speech, which speech is like an action, very similar to in Torah. Only manifestation in action can make that love whole. The love is insufficient. That's the short answer. The short answer to why I have mitzvahs is not the perfection of the lowly human being who has no connection with God. That's not why. The soul has an inherent connection with God. That inherent connection is then manifest in a finite existence, which includes intellect and emotions. Those emotions are not whole. They cannot be culminated in their connection with God without mitzvahs. That's the short answer. The function of the mitzvah is to give you a means to properly love God, which is it was radical when the Alter Rebbe said it. It's still radical now. Don't hear it so often, actually. Really. Honestly, it says it right here in Tanya, right? How often do you hear that's what a mitzvah is? It's surprising, right? The Tanya is like one of these things. This is like Sod. This is why it's called the secret, right? Yeah. It's called the secret because you read it and you learn it and you think about it, and still it's a secret. It's not. It's a whole life's work to think this way, right? While still having Judaism be Judaism. In other words, it's not the opposite of everything we know in the sense of throwing it all away. On the contrary, it's vivifying and bringing life to and transforming everything that we know. Every mitzvah of the Torah is a means of the soul expressing its love of God, and without being able to express it, the love would be incomplete, insufficient, and wouldn't be able to fulfill its purpose. In other words, the soul desperately loves God, so have some mercy and do a mitzvah. Let that love find culmination. Let that love not be an unfinished or an incomplete love. Let it be unrequited is a bit harsh, but that would mean God doesn't love you back. But an unfulfilled love. We'll discuss what that means. There's all of this. All of this sounds very poetic, but the ironic thing is that the Alter Rebbe explains it like an engineer. Let's read. We'll get to that part next class, God willing, probably. But let's read a little further here. Ki ha'ava, because love, hisheresh kol ramach mitzvahs aseh, is the root of all 248 positive mitzvahs. Umimena hein nimshachos, and from it, all of them are drawn. The mitzvahs, the 613 mitzvahs break down into 248 and 365. 248 positive mitzvahs corresponding to 248 of these 613 organs or limbs or aspects of the soul. 365 negative mitzvahs, as in thou shalt not, right, things to avoid, which are the other aspects of the soul. The 248 positive mitzvahs, in other words, things that you actually affirmatively do for God. It's a little bit more complicated than it may first seem, and no surprise, because there is a concept of a mitzvah that's a sheva al taiseh, not a kum va'aseh, which means you have a positive commandment that is fulfilled through passivity, not through action, right? And you have the opposite. You have a negative commandment which is fulfilled through action and not through passivity. Even though generally speaking you would think a thou shalt would mean to do something and a thou shalt not means not to do something. Of course in Judaism nothing could ever possibly be so simple. So it's much more complicated. But this is the point. The 248 positive mitzvahs, the thou shalts of the Torah are rooted in love. Love is the source of these mitzvahs. And if I would have told you this outside of the context of the fourth chapter of Tanya, you would think I mean the love of God. That's what you would think. It's not the love of God. We mean the love of the soul. Because where do the mitzvahs come from? The mitzvahs are just a manifestation of the godly soul. We're not talking about divine revelation at all, right? In fact, it turns out that we are. We'll see how that aspect of the mitzvahs as a divinely revealed external thing is there. And in fact, that's an essential component here. That is part of this story. We will see that as the chapter goes on. In other words, they are the mitzvahs of God as well. Right? But what are they? When you do the mitzvah, they are a manifestation of the love of the soul. Ubilada, and without love, ein lahen kiyum amiti. The commandments do not have permanence. They don't have true permanence, which true is another word for permanent in Chassidus. So true permanent means permanent permanence. They don't have permanent permanence, true permanence. They are not sustained. Without love, the mitzvahs are ephemeral. They do not last. That's the implication of the term kiyum amiti, right? Ki hamakayamon be'emes, because the person who fulfills the commandments in truth, who ha'oev es Hashem, is the one who loves, ha'oev es Shem Hashem, is the one who loves the name of God, v'chafetz ladavka be'emes, and he desires to cleave to him in truth. Ladavka means to cleave, to cling, to stick to. A profound form of attachment. When Rabbi Yoel used to teach people about dveikus, he used to say knit mit scotch tape. Dveikus means attached, not with scotch tape. We're talking about a deeper form of attachment, a profound form of attachment to God. The person who loves the person who fulfills the mitzvah in truth is the one who loves the name of God and desires to cling to God in truth. And here's the kicker for tonight's class: the ef shaladavka be'emes, and it is impossible to cleave to God in truth, kiyim bekiyum ramach pekudim, except through the fulfillment of the 613 mitzvahs. The 613 commandments are the only way that a person cleaves to God. So the argument is as follows. If you don't love God, there's no motivation to really do mitzvahs, which is why they don't have kiyum, right? They're not sustained. They're not permanent. They're impermanent. Why? Because all of those other reasons, long story short, we could argue, right? The truth is that this is really my idea, so take it for what it's worth as my idea. But the way I understand it, I understood it reading it today, preparing this class, is that none of the other reasons for doing mitzvahs are really according to the nature of the soul and the nature of mitzvahs. And since they're not natural, right? For example, mitzvahs are to make yourself a better person, for example. It's a guidebook for life, right? It's to make you smart. That's why we do, that's why it's to preserve your intellect, which is the classic Greek understanding of morality. Right? That morality is a buffer to protect your ability to reason, which is the true peak of existence, right? The peak of human existence, in the Greek understanding. So if you have those explanations for doing mitzvahs, it's not according to the true nature of mitzvahs. It's not according to what the mitzvahs actually are. All of those, by the way, are all animal soul reasons for keeping mitzvahs, which may be important, but are not what this chapter is about. This chapter is about the godly soul who knows why it wants to do mitzvahs, because mitzvahs are its natural expression. And for the godly soul, if the commandments of the Torah are able to be your natural soul expression, right? And you don't love God, there's no love, why would you keep doing mitzvahs? Right? In other words, if you have superficial reasons for doing mitzvahs and they're not done because they're self-expressions, so then there's many reasons to do mitzvahs and they can keep a person chained up forever, right? I'm too afraid not to do them. It works for every yeshiva student in the entire universe, right? It's too afraid not to do them. I'll get a knas if I don't do it, right? I'll get a fine. I'll have to pay money. I'll have to deposit my iPod or my phone or something like that, right? I'll get sent to detention. I won't be allowed to go home for the weekend, right? I'll burn in the fiery barbecue of eternity, right? Some have tried that as well. There's all sorts of reasons to behave a certain way, right? But none of these are truly sustainable. They don't make for mitzvahs that are forever, right? Mitzvahs that are forever are mitzvahs that are done because they are simply the manifestation of the godly soul. So if a person loves God, here's the argument. If a person loves God, they'll want to get close to God. That's really what love means in Chassidus, right? Love is a desire to cleave. The truth is that wanting to get close is a vast oversimplification. However, generally speaking, that's what love is in Chassidus. Ava wants to get close. Yira means wanting to get further away. Now, really, if you understand what these mean, it's not like physical moving closer and moving away. In many ways, it's not like that. We've actually already touched on this when we were discussing the spheres and the difference between Chassid and Gvura. Anyway, not to get too distracted. A person who loves God wants to be close. He wants dveikos. What he really wants is attachment, right? I want to be as close as possible to God, right? The only means that I can express my desire to be close to God are the mitzvahs. And therefore, if there is love of God, I will never stop doing mitzvahs. What do you mean? It's the natural desire of the manifestation of my heart. It's the thing that I love. So it gets me up in the morning, right? It's totally natural to me. It's my total natural self-expression for the godly soul of its love of God. I want to be close to God. There is no way for that love to be fulfilled. There is no way for that desire to be close to God to be culminated except through doing the mitzvahs. And that's the answer to the question of why is Judaism so focused on mitzvahs. One of the reasons why Judaism is so focused on mitzvahs, even though the godly soul is inherently one with God and doesn't need mitzvahs to be closer to God, the answer is that to express the love of the godly soul, it does need mitzvahs. Mitzvahs to express, to culminate, to fulfill that desire to be close to God, that is the love of the godly soul, is only possible through the fulfillment of the commandments, for reasons that the Alter Rebbe will explain when this class reconvenes. This class will probably only be reconvening 3 or 4 weeks from now. I'll keep you updated. This class is on hiatus for a few weeks. All right. Have a good evening, gentlemen. We'll see you next time.